Okay, so good morning, MPA SCRA Virtual Conference 2020 attendees. Welcome to our roundtable discussion that is in two parts. First, today, my team and I would like to present to you our research on the development of the Chicago Anti-Recidivism, or CAR, research program model. Second, we'll pose two questions to the audience for discussion if we have time, and address your questions and comments. The CAR model is a 12-component community participatory action research program that was designed to demonstrate a method for enhancing community collaborations, or working together towards the goal instead of in silos, and in a more fair, person-centered, supportive, equitable, just, informed, and empirical manner. The goal of the CAR model is to help reduce the recidivism rates of adults returning to society or reentry individuals who have had engagement with the criminal justice system, resulting in the incarceration in a local, state, or federal jail or prison institution by connecting them to key reentry resources. Communities where resources are limited or unavailable will also be underscored. For the purposes of this study, reentry individuals include those who are 18 years and older to 100 years and plus, committed violent or nonviolent crimes, and have diverse backgrounds, including but not limited to racial, economic, gender, and sexual orientations. This also includes those who are on probation or have been paroled. According to the National Institute of Justice, recidivism refers to a person's relapse into criminal behavior, often after the person receives or undergoes intervention for a previous crime. The purpose of the CAR model is to advance Chicago, and when taken to scale, other similar communities nationally and globally in the component areas to empower those returning to society and reduce their chances of recidivating. This partnership-based model is a generic model that is meant to be customized to any country. Each component of these academic and community-based partnerships is essential and pertinent to the effectiveness and efficiency of the proposed model program. Currently, this type of programming is germane to the age of COVID-19, especially in Chicago and other Midwestern communities. Cook County Jail in the city of Chicago is one of the largest jails in the nation, and also has possibly the highest rate of viral infections among inmates, and several inmates have died. Consequently, hundreds of inmates have recently been released from Cook County Jail to avoid the threat of COVID-19. These individuals returning to society need the collaborative support of their community, and to know immediately about available reentry resources that are available to them in their communities that will help to empower them and keep them from recidivating. We know that in Cook County Jail, the makeup, African Americans, 67%, Latinx, 19%, whites, 14%. Reducing recidivism in the state of Illinois may also help to balance the state budget which is currently in dire straits as a result of COVID-19 causing the entire state to close, including many businesses that may never recuperate. According to Caruso of 2018, even a small decrease in the recidivism rate can yield millions of dollars in taxpayer savings while improving public safety. So, community psychology principles that we are focused on currently: belief in the inherent dignity of all people in a community, prior social justice for all, prioritize constituents' voice, embrace and promote equity. Well-being is contextual, interdependent, and not reliant upon single individuals, but the entire communities, improving the quality of life of significant groups of individuals, transcending communities, institutions, systems, and policies, and empowering historically marginalized individuals and communities. So moving on, let's take a look at the components of the CAR model. At this point, I'm going to keep moving. Hopefully everyone can see this, but I can send it to you if you'd like a copy of it for yourself. We just want to take a brief look at the components of the CAR model. And so who's at the table? We definitely would like to have individuals who are returning to society to be a part of this collaboration to reduce recidivism. Politicians, policymakers, activists, which we've come to really know here lately in these past few days. Community gardens and beautification, and my colleague will talk about that. Education is important. These individuals need education at whatever level that they're at, including getting a GED, all the way up to getting a college education or beyond. We'd like to include at the table churches and faith-based institutions of a variety of sorts. Social justice is a big topic, so we'd like to have a focus on community and police partnerships and criminal justice system reform. So many of you probably saw the town hall with Barack Obama on a couple of days ago. Definitely housing and shelters. These individuals need to collaborate with us. This is one of the most important issues for an individual returning to society, that they have somewhere to go. Employment is equally important, including training and placement. And community organizations and agencies. We have several people on our team from the community, including Howard Brown Center, that are working with us, who already have other connections. The community of these individuals returning to society is essential. We want to have family members, mentors, peers, neighbors. And then community psychology researchers. This is what we do. I'm not a community psychologist, but I've been a community psychology researcher since the early 1990s. And I'm pleased to have several community psychologists on this team. And one will speak with you here shortly. And then last, many of these individuals receive their health and mental health services within the jail or penitentiary. So we need to be connected with individuals in the community who can carry on these services to them. So to talk about just briefly our action steps from this point, we'd like to submit our manuscript that includes a review of the literature and theoretical foundation of these 12 CAR components for publication submission by the end of the year. I'm going to mention 10 here. Number 2, identify key partners who will be committed to collaborate within the program. And then we'll select 12 program coordinators or key partners who will oversee each of the component areas. Of course, we'll apply for IRB approval and seek grant funding so that we can keep our people on board, including our students. Number 5, have program coordinators / key partners who are experts in the field, such as Christine and August, to share their resources, and the team will identify additional resources by zip codes in Chicago. We'll take those resources and list them in a handbook to disseminate to those returning to society, our partners, and the community. Number 7, we'd like to establish a website so that this information could be easily accessible. Number 8, we have a professor on our team who will conduct community mapping to illustrate available services in the Chicago metropolitan area and place this information in the handbook and on the website. We'd like to identify communities that are lacking in these resources and provide this information to our local aldermen and alderwomen. Number 9, we'd like to disseminate information to all collaborators who will then send this information to those individuals and agencies that are within their component areas, as well as those returning to society. And the last action step is we will be hosting a community psychology-based conference for individuals returning to society on November 13th, 2021. Here we'll highlight all CAR results, collaborators, the handbook, website, and community mapping. Program coordinators and key partners will present their research results, then host breakout sessions to then establish new collaborations.
Good morning. My name is Christine Robinson, and I'm trained as a developmental and community psychologist, and some of the work that I will discuss this morning was conducted as a consultant for the Lumina Foundation. Next slide, please. At this volatile moment in our nation's history, I start with the fact that policy matters. As community psychologists, we know that for transformative change to take place, it must shift the roles and relationships among people, transcending families, communities, neighborhoods, and states as outlined in Bronfenbrenner's socio-ecological model. External policies and systems have implications for our success, including the dominant cultural narratives and our specific identities. I think that this has been made clear by the disproportionate deaths in communities of color because of COVID-19 and the profound impact of police violence against people of color. Social circumstances and experiences at multiple levels of society affect our perspective, developmental outcomes, opportunity, economic security, and life course. Therefore, it's imperative to adopt a systemic framework as outlined in the socio-ecological framework. Policies at institutional, structural, local, regional, and state levels have direct impact, and they demonstrate who matters at scale. There's reciprocity across all the levels as we see at this time. Policies at the national, state, and local level have a direct impact for us as individuals. Next slide, please. Simon Sinek writes that lots of people know what they do or how they do it, and with those factors alone, you can certainly enjoy a fair amount of success. However, those people who turn their success into greatness all have one thing in common. They know their why. Why is at the heart of the work. Next slide, please. We know that narrative matters. The ways social issues are framed has a profound impact on us all. We see this today with the description of a violent criminal versus a man watching birds while black. Historically, people of color have been disproportionately accused and convicted. We must be mindful of this in our ability as a society to be compassionate. Who are returning citizens? Do we collectively recognize, welcome, and honor their promise? This narrative can be predictive of the outcomes. Next slide, please. People of color comprise the greatest proportion of US prison inmates, and 32% of those incarcerated have at least one disability. The need for human services and health services is evident and profound as these people return to communities. Most community-based nonprofits can provide the types of culturally fluent responses that honor the inherent dignity of people. Treating people with respect, understanding language, history, culture, traditions is a way of demonstrating that your life does matter. Next slide, please. Who controls the narrative? The external policy environment, the social sector environment, and the community environment all matter. Negative stories can be self-fulfilling prophecies. Some may experience a sense of conflict between their prior incarceration status, their future self, and uncertainty about their changing identity. High levels of marginalization and sidelining systemically work against oneself and sense of belonging and ability to achieve success. Experiences of homelessness and hunger confirm stereotypes that the person has no value. And these experiences make it difficult for historically marginalized returning citizens to move forward. Next slide, please. Moving beyond the deficit narrative that is crucial, we are painfully aware of these debilitating definitions of incarcerated persons. Society is replete with deficit narratives, and some examples are listed on the slide. A culture of forgiveness for those who have served their time and come home is an essential step in healing and building process. Next slide, please. COVID-19 has laid bare the health socioeconomic disparities in the US. Incarcerated people are at an extraordinarily high risk of infection as the virus rapidly spreads through prisons. The impact may be increased due to disability, lack of sanitation in prison, language barriers, lack of health care, race. There are a number of factors. Next slide, please. There are disproportionate rates of COVID-19 in prisons, and this is evidenced by the fact that those incarcerated are 2.5 times more likely to be positive for the virus. The most massive outbreaks in the United States have been in prisons. And jails are a potential mass spreading ground because they're filled with people, first of all, who've not yet been convicted. There's a lot of new entry from the population, and many folks lack medical care while they're there. Next slide, please. Overcrowding, older, more vulnerable populations, poor health, violence, and abuse exacerbate the situation in prison. Next slide, please. I now turn my remarks to the promise of release, employment, and education to increase success moving forward. And we all know that most of those who have been incarcerated will need a job upon release. COVID-19 has displaced many additional workers who are not documented in the data that were used for this slide. But this exacerbates the extremely challenging time for people seeking jobs and heightens the importance of community models. The diagram shows the displacement of African Americans from present jobs in office work, fast food, and machine production as a result of automation. African Americans are underrepresented in growth sectors, healthcare, legal professions, for example. The existing racial disparities are compounded by the economic displacement due to COVID-19. And the stigma of incarceration heightens the importance of community support. Next slide, please. The chart that Tonya, Dr. Hall mentioned earlier highlights an interesting, oh, actually, we missed a slide, Tonya, I think. Yes, this one, excuse me. This chart highlights interesting gender disparities, showing the jobs that many African American women have are less likely to be impacted by automation. Though the incomes may be low in those careers for women, such as home health care aides, child care, and teaching assistants, they're unlikely to be replaced by automation. However, the jobs currently held by many African American men are at risk, such as laborer, driver, truck or tractor operator. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, training in computer science, software, those types of areas of growth are all areas where men of color are significantly underrepresented. Next slide, please. There is hope in the model that Dr. Hall presented earlier that it may act as a passing gear to facilitate engagement in education. Next slide, please. I recently served as project director of a national demonstration project funded by the Lumina Foundation that focused on persistence and completion of post-secondary degrees by men of color. The site in Oakland, California was comprised solely of formerly incarcerated students. Laney College, Chabot College, University of California, Berkeley, for example, were deeply engaged in working with well over 500 students from ages 18 to 70, working on bachelor's, master's, and doctorates. Some had been incarcerated for more than 25 years, and much of the systems and policy work surrounded the issues of transfer of credits, for example, across different jurisdictions. Some inmates did not want to be released from prison until they had finished coursework or a degree. There's a significant amount of detail that I'm happy to share at another time, but it could fill up an entire webinar. Next slide, please. The major headlines are highlighted working across post-secondary from career and technical education, certificates, associate degrees, and bachelor's degrees, to policies and systems, and building a network to achieve self-determination. Next slide, please. The nonprofits were the unsung heroes of this work because the community systems provided trusting relationships, pathways to the community, accelerating completion, and widening career options through community networks. The project is currently seen as a model for policy change at the local, regional, and state level in California. And there's a document that I'm happy to share with people who are interested. Thank you so very much. And now I turn to Professor Hoffman.
Thank you very much, Christine, and I appreciate the time afforded us to present some of our work and information relevant to recidivism. My name is August Hoffman, and currently I serve as faculty member, primarily teaching community psychology and research design at Metropolitan State University in St. Paul, Minnesota. Much of my work, at least in the last 10 to 15 years, has primarily addressed community and psychological benefits of natural, or what is commonly referred to as green space environments. Specifically designed for this presentation, I presented a short discussion list that looks at how a particular population benefits those who are incarcerated, how green space and community gardening programs can benefit them very much. Next slide, please. So empirical research, at least within the last several years, has identified numerous community, physical, and psychological benefits of green space and natural environment work. More recently, what Diener and Ng refer to as social psychological prosperity, specifically when individuals are provided with opportunities to work in a variety of stewardship and volunteer programs. Compassion increases to help populations who are in need, who have suffered from some catastrophe. Next slide, please. Specifically for this presentation, I felt some of the research by Timler in 2019 was particularly relevant, because what Timler actually did was examine the benefits of gardening and green space activities to a particular population within prisons. And what Timler found was, I think most importantly, the overall positive effects that gardening programs had to those populations who were afforded opportunities to work outside and produce something green that could be donated, such as healthy foods, vegetables, fruits, and so forth. There were significant psychological benefits, and I think most importantly, the rate of recidivism decreased. I think that's particularly important to the overall theme and scope of this presentation. What are some of the kinds of things that we can do as a community that can help populations, incarcerated individuals, and reduce overall recidivism rates? Related to Timler's research, in the last couple of years, some of our students at Metropolitan State University and our partner at Inver Hills Community College, we created an outreach program at the Ramsey County Correctional Facility, which is a minimal security prison, where we secured a grant from the Minnesota State Department of Agriculture, and we planted 60 fruit-bearing apple trees that's primarily, that was basically maintained through the inmate population at Ramsey County. And in our post-surveys, our post-experimental surveys, we found that the inmates basically found that they were able to increase their feelings of self-efficacy and self-worth by participating in this community project, knowing that the foods grown, the apples, for example, would be donated to local food banks and distribution centers. So what we surmised from our research was that the opportunity to provide something that was meaningful to the community really increased self-worth to the prison population. Next slide, please. So there are numerous benefits to specific community gardening programs, and I think it might be worth taking a moment to ask ourselves specifically, well, what is it about specific types of stewardship or natural environment programs that are so beneficial? And at least in my own experiences, what I found over the years in working with students and community members at Metropolitan State is that people are highly, highly appreciative of opportunities to work together in real-time activities. Now, we're all aware of the restrictions of COVID-19, but it is interesting to note that outdoor work and gardening work is one of the few activities that have been exempted within higher education. So we're still able to create and maintain and continue our work in gardening activities. It's also important to note recent research by Gertner and colleagues found, again, when community members are provided with opportunities to engage in collective goals, working together, friction and conflict were reduced, which I think is particularly important during this particular time of our community. Next slide, please. So when individuals are provided with opportunities to participate in green or ecologically oriented projects, many of the individuals also reported a very key concept in community psychology, what we call a form of connectedness. In other words, a greater sense of belongingness and a sense of commitment to improving and working within their communities to make it more stronger and empowered. I think that's very important as we kind of move on to our phase of how can we examine our own communities to make them more holistic, to make them more rewarding, and helping people to work together. Next slide, please. Specifically, in the last 10 years since I've been at Metropolitan State, we've created a partnership with a local school, a community college, Inver Hills Community College. That was one of the first things that I discovered when I moved or transitioned here from out west was that the St. Paul area was a little bit impacted and it was hard to find space to create gardening programs. So I was able to work with the administrators at Inver Hills College, and we were allocated about a half acre of space where we created a memo of agreement between the two between Metro State and Inver Hills College, where students from both campuses would work collectively together in maintaining and developing not only community gardening programs, but also a fruit tree orchard where we have over 70 fruit-bearing trees, 16 different species of varieties. The understanding, the mission, and the overall purpose is that we would be implementing principles of community psychology in working to produce foods that would be donated to the local food banks and the food shelters in the Twin Cities area. And also in post-surveys, post-experimental research, we found that students reported a greater sense of belonging and connectedness to their communities after they're working together. Next slide, please. So that's just one picture, an example of some of the healthy fruits that our students and community members have worked together in harvesting. These foods are donated to local food banks. Last year, we harvested over 6,000 pounds of healthy foods, vegetables, and fruits. I think just as a caveat, especially this year, given some of the unrest that we're seeing, healthy foods is going to be a critical factor in providing to the needs of people within society. And I think many times students have asked me, how can they help and participate? And my response has always been in terms of providing healthy foods to populations impacted directly, either through COVID-19 or the unrest that we're experiencing in the Twin Cities right now. Next slide. And that's just another picture of some of the foods that our students have grown. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hoffman and Ms. Robinson for your presentation. So basically, we are not happy with individuals leaving jail settings with a couple of dollars, maybe a bus pass, and just being told, go and make it on your own. We want to make a difference. We want to assist these individuals to have, be aware of all of the services that are available to them. And if these services are not available in their community, we'd like to highlight that and change policy issues through our research. Any final comments before we take questions? Well, thank you, everyone. Amber, if you'll give us the name of the individual and the question, we'll move forward.
Okay. All right, so the first question comes from Tiffany Jimenez. And her question is, does the current configuration of the justice system still match with the justice needs of people?
I would say no, that the justice system, the criminal justice system needs to be reformed. And we've been focused on some of President Barack Obama's work in this area. I think the town hall speaks to your question that changes need to be made. The criminal justice system, as far as we're concerned, is broken, particularly for a number of people, and needs to be changed. And so that's why we have it as a component to bring those individuals to the table and keep abreast of the changes that are being made. The Safer Foundation, they do have a policy conference every year that speaks to this, and they keep us informed of some of the changes that have been made and some of the policy issues that politicians are putting forth. And so that's a good place to start to have more information regarding your question.
I would jump in and say that there's significant need for change. I think one of the big challenges here, and I will speak from my own perspective, is that in the US, we have a very punitive system. As I think a lot of people are well aware across the world, a lot of folks believe in rehabilitation. And so it seems that we're more interested in punishing people than we are in helping them move forward to next steps. And so I think a lot of it has to do with worldview. And as I talked about narratives and classifications, how can you ever do anything decent with people that you view as dirty, bad, impossible? So all of this, I think, has infused the way that our systems interface with people. And if we believe in their inherent dignity and that everybody has possibility, there's a way to turn the system on its head. So it's much more focused on rehabilitation and not focused on punishment. And I think that that is a key paradigm shift. But with the history in this country of the justice system and of racial disparities, I know that that's a steep climb, but I think it's possible. And frankly, I think it's necessary, because as you look at some of the way that other justice systems are fashioned around the world, particularly in Scandinavian countries, the paradigm is completely different. And the way that they treat people who are incarcerated is completely different.
Yeah, if I could just briefly add on to what Christine mentioned, I would agree 100% that there is a great disconnect and we need to transition from punitive action to potential. And I think focusing on the skills and aptitudes that people have while incarcerated and maximizing those skills is absolutely important. We have not done that.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to be too political, but I think in light of the era that we're in and knowing this group as I know it, I think most people are very well aware that the current police system is based on what in generations before were slave catchers. And so what kind of system do you expect coming out of that kind of history? So I'm just being upfront about it.
And we have another question from Rafael Rivera. How do we promote models focused on trauma, ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences, ecological models, and the criminal justice system?
Well, our model does include ACEs under the health and mental health system. So we are we have one person that's on our team that did their dissertation just recently on ACEs, and so we will incorporate that into our model. I'm not familiar with an additional model regarding ACEs.
And I think developmentally, the whole ACEs and socioecological model is the reality that adverse childhood experiences, and I think we're very, very well aware of that when you look at the prison population, that the population itself has disproportionately experienced numerous adverse childhood experiences. So I think part of it also is very closely aligned, and I don't want to get too far off point, but with education reform, because many in this community are very well aware of the school to prison pipeline, and particularly with students who are classified with disabilities, because in the United States, we've been reticent to really be inclusive and focus on learning differences and capacities. And so children at young ages who are told that they were bad, who are marginalized, undereducated, and teachers don't have the facility to figure out how to manage some of their learning styles and capacities, it's become a structural issue that disproportionately, and that's why I mentioned 32% of folks who are incarcerated have disabilities. And a lot of them are not appropriately placed in a penal system. They should be in a different structure that really is looking at their developmental capacity and what we can do. And that's why I was saying, if we were focused on rehabilitation, it's really looking at a whole host of different nuances in the assets that people have and how one can build upon them. Because if you really believe in the inherent dignity of all people, you believe that everyone has assets.
Right. I think also essentially it's strength-based. What we have as a driving need for community psychologists is to focus on what people are doing well and what works for them and to capitalize on those skills and traits, not on a deficit model, but rather the strength-based model.
And I just want to make note to all conference registrants, you will have access to the email addresses of the presenters. Some of you have mentioned that you'd like to connect with these presenters offline for models and additional things. So just want to make note that that will become available within a week after the conference. We have a few more minutes for a few questions, for another question. Does anyone else have another question they would like to pose to our panelists?
There was a comment in the chat from Raphael.
So let's see. So Raphael's comment is the mayor from Los Angeles' decision to reallocate funding from public safety to the community is a great example to follow. Do our panelists want to comment on that?
I think it's a step definitely in the right direction. Unfortunately, community funding is typically the first that gets cut in times of economic recession and so forth. I think to be proactive in the step to reallocate funding to build communities in terms of providing greater resources to prevent recidivism is fundamentally an important step. And I think it's hopefully going to provide some positive results in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And we have oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I just was going to say that I think we all know as psychologists that marginalization and being isolated in itself, we've experienced it recently with the whole kind of shutdown and what that does and how it feels. We're not in prison, we're in our own homes, but the single fact of isolating people from social connections and community has a psychological effect. And so the question around the mayor of Los Angeles providing funds to focus on community is a great example of how can you be included and how can you work through community organizations and agencies to build community. Because for many people who've been told over time that they're not valued and they don't matter and have been ostracized from community need some affirmation. And so when we look at the individual level, again, going back to the socio-ecological model, coming from the outside policies into the individual, it makes the community coming around and having those kinds of resources can actually make a significant difference in personal outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to have two final questions. So we have one attendee with their hand raised, and we have one question that was submitted in the chat box. And I'll do the submitted in the chat box first, and then we'll do the raised hand attendee, Chris Keys. So the question in the chat box is from Dr. Vanita Perkins. Can I ask what compels the panelists to continue this work?
Well, I think we're passionate about making a difference in this area. We see the need for many individuals returning to society to have these resources available. They don't know. They don't know about these resources in their communities, and they don't know about these resources in the city in general. So we'd like to see that change. We'd like to make sure that they are empowered to the best of our ability to help them to make a difference and to live a life free of returning to jail.
You know, for me, there's a term used frequently in community psychology, giving away the byline. And for the work that I do with students in the classroom, that is rewarding. Teaching theory is very different than applying theory, especially with community psychologists. So when our students read about resilience, oppression, empowerment, giving them an opportunity to work in natural environments to produce something as nourishing and sustaining as healthy foods, and to see the positive effect that it has on them and the populations that they're working with is very rewarding. That's why I continue my work.
Mm-hmm. My motivation for the past 30 years, I've done nothing but work on systems and policies that are focused on marginalized populations, because I am heartbroken by the amount of disparities and the messages as a society that we put upon people, which unfortunately in my experience has done nothing but exacerbate the disparities. And so I keep on moving forward because in the model I mentioned in Oakland and other projects I've had the privilege of being involved in, I see some progress. And I'm heartened by the possibility that some lives will actually get better over time. So whatever I can do in my little corner, I'm going to keep on trying to push the boulder uphill.
Yeah.
And how many people are aware of trying to do a project, even having this conference all alone, right? But when you have a team of individuals, that's why, we're setting up this collaboration model, working together and passionate about what we're doing. That's when I think we start to make a difference.
And we have time for the one live question from Chris Keys. Chris, you're unmuted. Did you want to share your question?
Sure. Yeah, I was focusing on the gardening presentation, August, and wondering in what ways gardening might lead to reduced recidivism and increasingly positive life post-incarceration. And do you have any plans moving forward to address positive opportunities after prison?
Well, thanks, Chris. Great question. I know in the previous research that we discussed, I think the key connection with green space activity, gardening, and fruit tree orchards, forestry programs with the prison populations is it provides them directly with a sense of self-worth and self-efficacy. And if people have discovered a particular skill that they can do something that helps others, they're more likely to carry that skill outside into society. So I think that's the primary link. It also gives them something, a sense of awareness and appreciation of nature, and that something actually depends on them to exist. So rather than just kind of waking up and turning on TV or not knowing what to do, if certain populations, at least this was the experience I had at Ramsey County Correctional, which is a minimal security facility. Mm-hmm. Some of the prisoners indicated that they appreciated the fact that they had an opportunity to go outside, to be outside, to experience natural elements, and to take care of something that was growing that would eventually produce something that would be nourishing for the community itself. There's lots of work to do, certainly in the future, to continue these types of programs, which I do intend to.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Want to thank our panelists for sharing their work that they are doing. For those of you that you posed a question and we didn't have an opportunity to get to it, we'll share it with the attendees, and you'll also have access to their contact information. So this does not have to be the end of the conversation, but simply the beginning of the engagement.